Join me Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern, where we'll play a very special edition of live NFL Draft Trivia, where you get to test your knowledge about everything and anything related to the draft for a chance to win cash prizes. Link to join below. And now, on with our feature presentation. Think of what head coaches say when their team drafts a player in the first round. Usually, it's incredibly praiseworthy. They'll say things like, "We really like this guy and we think he can contribute right away." Or things like, "Our scouts were raving about him, and we knew that if he was on the board when we were on the clock, that he was going to be our pick." Or things like, "This guy fills a need, and we haven't had a player like this on our team in a while, and I'm excited to see what he can bring to the team." You're usually hearing something along those lines, and doing a story on a coach saying something like this is completely pointless, because it's not news, and you'd expect a coach to say something along those lines. Again, they drafted the player, so they obviously like him. As you probably guessed, this is not one of those stories. Because I want you to imagine the head coach, upon his team drafting a player, speaking to reporters in a press conference and saying, "Yeah, we might have made a mistake, and we're having second thoughts about actually drafting the guy." You realize how ridiculous that sounds, right? You literally just drafted him in the first round, and you're already talking about how you would have done things differently? It makes you look completely incompetent, must destroy the confidence of the player that you just drafted, and makes you look like you have no idea what you're doing. Well, as insane as this entire situation might seem, in 1975, that's exactly what happened with the New Orleans Saints. Because after the Saints drafted Purdue wide receiver Larry Burton, head coach John North immediately expressed regrets, saying this might not have been the best move. And the only thing funnier than this draft day incident is how the careers of the two players involved played out. Because let's just say that one side clearly came out on top. And this is the story behind the biggest draft regret in Saints history. Before I talk about the actual draft choice in question and why the Saints were immediately regretful of their all-important decision, we need some context to understand why the Saints made their initial move, as well as what happened in the immediate aftermath that caused this whole dilemma in the first place. The good news for the Saints in 1974 was that they had their best season in franchise history. The bad news was that what that meant was a 5-9 finish and a third-place finish in the NFC West instead of a fourth-place finish. Yeah, the Saints were not a good team, and a big reason for that was their absolutely anemic passing game. Don't get me wrong, Archie Manning was a very good quarterback, even if the stats didn't necessarily show it, but he was not getting any help whatsoever, especially when it came to the wide receiver department. There is a reason that the Saints finished 22nd in the league out of 26 teams in passing yards, 22nd in passing touchdowns, and 24th in yards per passing attempt. And that's because their receivers were awful in every sense of the word, with a lot of drops and not a lot of production. For some perspective on just how bad the Saints were at the receiver position, there were 31 players in the NFL to have at least 500 receiving yards in 1974. The New Orleans Saints had a grand total of none of them on their roster, as their leader, Bob Newland, had 490, which ranked 34th. The New York Jets had 3 players in Rich Castor, David Knight, and Jerome Barkham cross 500 yards. The Saints had none. They had Bob Newland and Joel Parker as their wide receivers, and Paul Seal at tight end. And Newland, who was their leader in yardage, wouldn't play another game in the NFL after the 1974 season due to needing surgery on his knee, which the team knew about at the time of the draft. Additionally, there were 183 players in the NFL to have at least 90 receiving yards in 1974. If you do the math and divide those out amongst 26 teams, then each team should have 7 or so players to eclipse this mark. The Chargers, for instance, had 9 such players. The Saints had 4. They were thin up top, they were thin when it came to depth, and entering the draft, this already weak group was getting even worse. If the Saints were going to have any chance whatsoever of competing in 1975, then they were going to have to surround Archie Manning with some talent, because it was apparent that he couldn't do it all on his own. With that, they decided to spend the 7th pick in the draft on Purdue wide receiver Larry Burton. I'll show his highlights later on, simply because I want you to appreciate just how awful New Orleans was at throwing the football in 1974. However, Burton was the first wideout taken off the board, and it's not too hard to see why. He was insanely fast, and could beat just about any cornerback you put on him because of his blazing speed. In fact, he was so fast that he represented Team USA in the 200-meter dash at the 1972 Summer Olympics, where he finished in 4th place. And as dominant as he was on the track, he was just as dominant on the football field, as in 1974, he finished the season with 38 receptions for 702 yards, both of which led the Big Ten. Burton became just the third player in Purdue history to lead the Big Ten in receiving yards, and just the second player to lead the conference in receptions, joining Bob Hadrick, who did this in 1963. He was named a first-team All-American for his efforts, and despite only playing 2 seasons, is on the ballot for the College Football Hall of Fame. That's how good he was. So this seemed like a logical fit, right? The Saints clearly need a receiver, and they took the guy that, on paper, was one of the best in the game. Well, about 5 minutes later, something happened entirely unrelated to anything that Burton did that would completely change their mindset. This is defensive lineman Billy Newsome, and when he started out his career with the Baltimore Colts back in 1970, he was an exceptional player. He was so good, in fact, that he recorded 22.5 sacks in his first 3 seasons with the team, and finished second on the team in 1970 as a rookie with 8.5 sacks, as the Colts won their first Super Bowl in franchise history. In 1973, the Saints and new head coach John North were so high on him that they traded away a first-round pick to acquire his talents. Yes, the move left the Saints without a first-round pick for the 1973 NFL Draft. But who cares? You're getting a 25-year-old proven commodity who is guaranteed to come in there and do some work on the defensive line. And right off the bat, Newsome was really good. He led the team in 1973 by tying his career high with 8.5 sacks, and was named the MVP of the team as well. The trade was off to a fantastic start. But after the 1974 season, Newsome's relationship with the Saints completely soured. He was tired of the losing, saying that he wanted to play for a winner. He knew that he wasn't the problem with the Saints, and that there was just a lack of talent around him, saying, "I was 5-9 for 2 years with the Saints. I knew I was doing my job. The older you get, the more you learn." And he was unhappy that at the end of the season, after missing some time with a pinched nerve in his neck, that he wasn't able to reclaim his starting spot, which didn't seem to make a whole lot of sense in the eyes of himself as well as Saints fans. As Newsome said on this, "If they really needed me, they would have played me." He was an unhappy camper down in New Orleans and wanted to be traded. Just like that, arguably the best defensive player on the team wanted out. And fortunately for Newsome, he got his wish. Because moments after the Saints chose Burton, the New York Jets came calling and made an offer that the Saints seemingly couldn't refuse. The Saints would give the Jets their star defensive tackle, and in return, the Jets would give them a first-round pick. Coach North didn't want to let Newsome go, but at that price, he felt comfortable doing it, especially since he promised Newsome that he'd do everything in his power to cater to his trade request and to do whatever he could to make it happen. As North said, "Billy had been in to see me twice this year asking to be traded. He wasn't happy in New Orleans, and his wife wasn't happy. I told him I would trade him if I could, even though he would be hard to replace." So the Saints definitely had a feeling that Newsome would not be back in 1975, and this trade officially confirmed it. And at this moment, North had a revelation, because at that moment in time, he thought to himself about that Burton pick, "Holy crap, we drafted the wrong player." Now before I go any further, I just have to emphasize this. There are plenty of times where a general manager or a head coach will talk in the post-draft press conference and say how they were debating between 2 players, and will even name drop the player that would have been their second choice, but ultimately decided to go for the player that they wound up drafting. That's not what this is about, because again, teams do this all the time, and usually when a front office member says this and is transparent, they're doing this to go inside the process, and not to bash the player that they literally just drafted. As a hypothetical, if Mike Tomlin said last year that the Steelers wanted a running back and were debating between Najee Harris and Travis Etienne, by saying that, he's merely taking you inside the war room. He's not saying that if he could do it over, he would have taken Etienne. He's happy with Harris. There is a very clear difference between that and doing what the New Orleans Saints did in 1975. Because North flat out said that if he could have a do-over, knowing the information that he knew, that he would have done things differently, and would not have picked Larry Burton. This man right here, the track star and Purdue standout, he wouldn't be a Saint if North had his way. As he said, "When we picked Burton, we had no idea the Jets would be doing business for Newsome. If we had known then that we would be trading Billy, we might have gone for grambling defensive tackle Gary Johnson." I'm sorry, why the heck are you saying this? Number one, it's not like this was a trade that came completely out of nowhere. It's not like you had no intentions of getting rid of Newsome, and then the Jets came calling and offered you 3 first-round picks to the point where you would be idiots for not taking the trade. Not only were you expecting a trade, but you were actively shopping him and making him available. You knew that it was more than likely that Newsom would not be back with the Saints in 1975. So you knew that you needed a defensive tackle. How did this bit of business with the Jets change your philosophy? The fact that you would need a defensive tackle in 1975 was the least surprising development of all time. And number 2, good job making Burton unhappy. How do you think Burton's gotta feel when moments after drafting him, he realizes that the team made a mistake and that they don't really want him? Good job shattering his confidence and belief in your organization to run a competently tight ship. Good job making the fans turn against you as well, because I'm sure after 8 straight losing seasons to start off their franchise's history, with 5 or fewer wins in all 8 of them, that the man in charge saying that they drafted the wrong guy is going to give them tons of confidence and belief that this is the year that things finally turn around. Look, I appreciate transparency a lot. It makes my job a heck of a lot easier to do stories when these people have no filters and just say whatever comes to their mind. But there are some things where even if you truly believe it, you shouldn't say it, because there's nothing good that can come out of that whatsoever. And it especially can't be good if, hypothetically, the player that you wound up drafting goes on to become a giant bust, while the player that you said you would have drafted if you could do it all over again turned out to be a superstar and one of the best players to ever play this position. But surely that won't happen, right? The good news for the Saints is that of the 2 guys they were debating on, the one they didn't wind up taking that they would have taken if they had a do-over with Gary Johnson turned out to be next to nothing in the NFL. He was a complete bust in every sense of the word. So the Saints could sleep easy at night with this decision, knowing that even if their guy didn't work out, at least they didn't wind up with Johnson. There was no way whatsoever that Johnson could have helped the Saints win games and help their defense out, because he did nothing of note in the NFL. Except for his 1977 season where he had 13.5 sacks, finishing 5th in the NFL in this category, finishing 2nd in the AFC behind Pat Toomey of the Oakland Raiders, and finishing 2nd amongst all defensive tackles in the league in that category behind Cleveland Elam of the San Francisco 49ers, which means that he led all AFC defensive tackles in sacks. And there was the 1978 season where the Chargers led the AFC with 54 sacks, and Johnson was 3rd on that team with 8.5 of them. Oh, and there was the 1979 season where the Chargers had the 2nd best defense in football, won the number 1 seed in the conference, and Johnson made it to the first Pro Bowl of his career. And there was the 1980 season where the Chargers once again got the number 1 seed, and Johnson was named the first team All-Pro of the Associated Press and was named a Pro Bowler, because he finished the season with 17.5 sacks, which led the NFL and made him the first Charger to ever lead the NFL in this category, although 2 men did this while the Chargers were in the American Football League. He also set the franchise record for most sacks in a single season, and that record still holds up today. And there was the 1981 season, where Johnson made it to another Pro Bowl and was named a first-team All-Pro yet again after finishing with 10 sacks, which was the most on the team. And there was the 1982 season, where Johnson made it to his 4th straight Pro Bowl and was named the 2nd-team All-Pro. And there was the 1984 season, where he joined the San Francisco 49ers, recorded 3 sacks in the playoffs, and played a key part in San Francisco winning Super Bowl 19 over the Miami Dolphins, winning their 2nd title in franchise history. And there was the fact that by the time his career ended, he had 76.5 sacks, 4 Pro Bowl appearances, 2 first-team All-Pro appearances, a 2nd-team All-Pro appearance, and had the all-time record at the time for most career sacks in Chargers history. Yeah, when I say that Johnson did nothing in the NFL, I was completely lying, because around the turn of the decade, he might have been the best defensive tackle in the NFL. But hey, the Saints did just fine themselves in the end, because all Larry Burton did was play 3 seasons with the team, score 4 touchdowns while catching 35 passes, join the San Diego Chargers of all teams in 1978, and be out of the NFL by 1979 after just 5 years. Gary Johnson made as many Pro Bowls as Larry Burton caught touchdowns with the Saints. Really tough call as to whether or not the Saints made the right call here by going with Burton over Johnson. There are tons of hindsight picks that happened well after the draft, that if they could do it all over again years later, they would have done things differently. But you're not seeing too many situations like this, where the man in charge is flat out admitting about 5 minutes after making the pick that he messed up and wanted to use the Madden Rewind feature or a different save file or a time machine to do things differently. I don't know what's crazier, the fact that the Saints didn't foresee this need at defensive tackle in the first place, or the fact that the man that they would have taken was a star, while the man they wound up taking was one of the biggest busts in the history of the franchise. So I guess the moral of the story is that if you're having second thoughts about drafting a prospect, keep them to yourself, because if you don't, you're going to look utterly moronic, just like the Saints did roughly half a century ago. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9. To see college football videos, subscribe to JaguarGator8. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.